The night my stepmother threw me out, the rain was coming down so hard that the streetlights looked like they were melting. I stood on the curb outside the only house I'd ever called home with 2 garbage bags at my feet and a backpack that weighed more than I did, and I watched my father close the curtains in the living room window. He didn't look at me. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Not once. Linda was somewhere behind him, I knew, saying whatever she'd been saying for the last 3 years, the slow drip of words that had turned my father from a man who used to braid my hair before school into a stranger who couldn't meet my eyes. I was 19 years old. I had $47 in my wallet, a phone with a cracked screen, and an envelope my grandfather's lawyer had mailed me 8 months earlier that I'd never opened because every time I looked at it I started crying. My name is Hattie Reeves, and that envelope was about to save my life. I just didn't know it yet. I walked to the bus station because I couldn't think of anywhere else to go. The girl behind the counter took one look at me, soaked through and shivering, and gave me a cup of coffee from the back without ringing it up. I sat in a plastic chair under a flickering fluorescent light, and I opened the envelope for the first time. Inside was a key on a piece of twine, a folded sheet of legal paper, and a handwritten note in my grandfather's blocky print. The note said, "For Hattie, when you need it, not before." The legal paper said that the property at 412 Mercer Street in a town called Bowdrie, 260 miles north of where I was sitting, now belonged to me. Free and clear, taxes paid through the end of the year. My grandfather had owned a pawn shop there for 41 years before he died, and apparently he'd left it to me without telling anyone, including my father. I sat there in the bus station with that key in my palm, and I thought about my grandfather for the first time in a long time without crying. He'd been the only person in my life who looked at me the way my mother used to before she got sick, like I was someone worth looking at. He used to drive down to see me twice a year, every year, even after Linda made it clear she didn't want him in the house. He'd take me out for ice cream, and ask me about books and listen when I told him things. Really listen, the way grown-ups almost never do. The last time I saw him alive, I was 16, and we'd sat on a bench by the river and he'd said, "Hattie, you remember this. You ever get into trouble, you ever feel like the world's pushed you too far, you come find me. You don't ask anybody for permission. You just come." Then he died of a heart attack 4 months later, alone in the back room of his shop, and I hadn't been allowed to go to the funeral because Linda said it would be too upsetting, and my father had agreed with her like he agreed with everything she said. I bought a ticket on the next bus heading north. $43. I had $4 left after that, which felt about right. The bus pulled out at 1:30 in the morning, and I sat in a window seat at the back and watched my whole life shrink to nothing in the dark. I didn't cry. I'd done all my crying earlier, in the bathroom, while Linda stood outside the door listing all the things wrong with me. The bus rolled through the rain for 6 hours, and I didn't sleep. I just held the key and watched the road, and tried not to think about my father pulling the curtains closed. We got into Bowdrie a little after 7 in the morning. It was the kind of town I'd seen in pictures, but never been to, the kind with a main street that still had a hardware store and a diner and a barber pole that actually spun. The sky was the color of dishwater. I walked from the bus stop with my garbage bags over my shoulders and my backpack on my back, and people stared at me because of course they did. A teenager dragging her whole life through the middle of a small town at 7 in the morning is going to get stared at. I asked a woman walking a dog where Mercer Street was, and she pointed and said it was about 4 blocks. And then she looked me up and down and asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and she didn't believe me, but she didn't push it either, which I appreciated. Mercer Street was tucked behind the main drag, narrow and quiet, lined with old brick buildings that had clearly been somebody's pride and joy a long time ago, and were now just somebody's responsibility. Number 412 was 3 doors down from the corner. It had a wooden sign hanging over the door that said Reeves Pawn in faded gold paint, and the windows were so dirty I couldn't see through them. There was a padlock on the door, a chain across the handles, and a notice taped to the glass that said the property had been inspected for code violations and the owner was responsible for bringing it into compliance. I stood in the rain looking at it for a long time. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a tomb, but it was mine. I pulled out the key my grandfather had left me and tried it in the padlock, and it didn't fit, which I should have expected. Of course it didn't. The padlock had been put on by the city, not by him. I sat down on the wet step with my bags around me, and I thought about crying, but I was too tired, so I just sat there for a while. After maybe 20 minutes, a man came out of the shop next door, a barber shop with a sign that said Hennings, and he looked at me and frowned. He was in his 60s maybe, thin gray hair, suspenders, the kind of face that had been carved by working outdoors and laughing a lot. "You lost?" he said. "No." "You sure?" "I'm Hattie Reeves." I said it like I was daring him to argue. "My grandfather was Floyd Reeves. He left me this place." The man went very still. He looked at me, and then at the door, and then at me again, and something happened in his face that I couldn't read at the time, but understood later. Recognition. Sorrow. A little bit of relief. "Floyd's granddaughter," he said quietly. "I'll be damned. He talked about you." He came down off his step and held out his hand, and I shook it. His grip was warm and dry. "Augustus Henning. Folks call me Gus. I was your grandfather's friend for 38 years. He told me you'd come someday." That was when I started crying. Not big crying, just a thin, steady leaking out of my eyes that I couldn't stop. Gus didn't say anything about it. He took one of my garbage bags and said, "Come inside before you catch pneumonia, child. I've got coffee, and I've got the spare key to that lock because I was the one who put it on after the city did theirs. You and me are going to figure this out." I followed him into his barber shop and I sat in one of his chairs, and he made me a cup of coffee with 3 sugars and a splash of cream, because he said that was how Floyd took it, and probably I would too. He was right. He told me about my grandfather while I warmed up. How Floyd had kept the pawn shop going through 3 recessions and 2 divorces and the slow death of every small business on Mercer Street. How he'd been kind to people who needed kindness and tough with people who needed toughness, and how he'd always paid his bills on time. How after he died, the shop had just sat there for almost a year because nobody knew what to do with it. There was a will, Gus said, but it had been complicated, and there were some debts, and the city had come in and put violations on the door, and pretty much everyone in Bowdrie had assumed the building would eventually be sold for back taxes and turned into a tanning salon or something. But Floyd had a plan, Gus said. He told me. He said his granddaughter was going to come for it one day. He said he just had to keep it for her until she did. He said that. Gus looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup. "Hattie, I don't want to pry, but you look like you came a long way with not much, and you came at 7 in the morning in the rain, and you don't have anybody with you. Are you in trouble?" I told him a version of it. The short version. My mother had died when I was 12. My father had remarried 2 years later. A woman named Linda who taught Sunday school and brought casseroles to grieving widowers, and who, the second the ring was on her finger, had begun a slow and patient campaign to make me feel like a tenant in my own house. The fights had gotten worse as I got older, and last night had been the last one. The one where she'd told my father it was her or me, and my father had said nothing, and Linda had handed me garbage bags and stood there while I packed, and that was it. That was the whole story. 19 years compressed into 3 minutes of explanation in a barber shop. Gus listened all the way through and didn't interrupt, and didn't make a face, and didn't tell me Linda was a witch even though I could tell he was thinking it. When I finished, he said, "Well, you're home now." He gave me the key to the padlock, and he walked me back to the pawn shop, and he stood on the sidewalk while I unlocked the chain and pushed the door open for the first time. The smell hit me first. Dust and old paper and something faintly sweet underneath, like pipe tobacco and varnish, the smell of my grandfather's clothes. I stood in the doorway, and I breathed it in, and for the first time in 2 years I felt like I could fill my lungs all the way up. The shop was bigger than it looked from outside. A long, narrow room with glass display cases running along both walls, a battered wooden counter at the back with an old brass cash register on top, and a doorway behind the counter that led somewhere I couldn't see from the front. The display cases were mostly empty. A few watches, a couple of guitars on stands, a violin in a case, some jewelry that had probably been left behind because nobody had ever come back to claim it. Dust over everything. A film of it on the glass like the whole place had been wrapped in gauze. Gus stayed by the door. "I haven't been in here since the cleanup after he passed," he said. City came through, took the inventory log, made a note of what was here. They were going to auction it all if the building went under. Floyd's lawyer fought them on it. Said the property and contents weren't to be touched until the inheritor came forward. "That'd be you." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Why didn't anyone call me?" "Lawyer tried, child. He sent that letter. He said he sent 2 more after it. Did your daddy ever mention?" I shook my head. He hadn't. Linda probably got to the mail before he did. Linda got to everything before he did. Gus nodded like he wasn't surprised. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." He told me he'd be next door if I needed anything, and he left me there to walk through the shop alone. And that was the thing he did right, because I needed to do it alone. I walked the length of the shop slowly. I touched the counter. I ran my finger through the dust and looked at the smear it left. I opened the cash register and found $3 in coins and a yellowed receipt for a fishing reel from 2007. There was a calendar on the wall from the year my grandfather died, turned to the month he died, with a circle around the date he died, which he obviously hadn't made. Somebody, probably Gus, had drawn that circle. I stood looking at it until my eyes blurred. Then I went around the counter and through the doorway into the back. The back was a single large room, almost as big as the front of the shop, with a workbench along one wall and a cot in the corner where my grandfather had clearly slept at least some of the time. There was a small bathroom off the side, a hot plate on a shelf, a half-full bottle of bourbon and 2 glass tumblers, a bookshelf with paperbacks. It looked like a man's life pared down to its smallest possible footprint, and it looked, weirdly, like it had been waiting for someone. The cot had a folded blanket on it. The hot plate was unplugged but clean. The bourbon was still sealed past the broken seal, meaning he'd opened it but hadn't drunk it dry. The whole back room had the quality of a held breath. And then I saw the door. It was on the far wall, almost hidden behind a wooden cabinet that had been pushed in front of it. A heavy metal door, painted the same dingy beige as the wall, with no handle on the outside, just a keyhole. The kind of door you don't put in a back room of a pawn shop unless you have a very specific reason for it. I stood there looking at it for what felt like a long time. The key on the twine around my neck was suddenly very heavy. I walked over and pulled the cabinet away from the door. It was lighter than it looked, mostly empty, just balanced there to hide what was behind it. The keyhole was a tarnished brass plate with a small slot. I held up the key my grandfather had left me, and I knew before I tried it that it was going to fit. It fit. I turned it. The lock turned smoothly, like it had been oiled recently, which it couldn't have been, which it must have been. I pushed the door open. Behind it was a second room, smaller than the back room, maybe 10 feet square. No windows. A single light bulb hanging from the ceiling on a chain, with a string pull. I pulled it. The bulb buzzed on, and I stood in the doorway of my grandfather's back room, and I forgot how to breathe. The room was full. Not crowded, not crammed, but full in the careful way that a museum is full. Shelving along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, with items arranged on them in a way that made it clear someone had taken time with the arrangement. A small wooden table in the center with a single chair. A safe in one corner, an old one, the kind with a combination dial. On the shelves were boxes. Wooden boxes, leather boxes, small metal cases, velvet pouches. Some of them had labels in my grandfather's blocky handwriting. Others didn't. I couldn't make sense of any of it at first. My brain was tired and the light was bad, and I'd been crying off and on for 15 hours. I took a step into the room. The air was cooler in there, drier, like he'd done something to control the humidity. I reached out and touched one of the boxes on the nearest shelf. It was an old leather case, the kind you'd carry pocket watches in. I lifted it down and set it on the table and opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark blue velvet, were 5 gold coins. I'm no expert. I have never been an expert at anything. But I had eyes, and the coins were obviously old, obviously heavy, obviously not the kind of thing you buy at a gas station. Each one was bigger than a quarter, and the gold caught the light from the bulb above me and threw it back warm and rich. I picked one up. It was heavier than I expected. I turned it over in my hand and read the date stamped on the back. 1881. I sat down in the chair. I sat down very carefully because my legs had stopped working. I looked around the room again, slower this time, taking it in. There were maybe 30 boxes on the shelves. Maybe 40. I couldn't tell. Some of them were small, some were larger. There was a long flat case on the bottom shelf that looked like it might hold a sword or a long piece of jewelry. There were several rolled tubes of canvas leaning against the wall. There was the safe. There was, on the table in front of me, next to where I'd set the box, a thick manila envelope I hadn't noticed when I came in. My name was on it. Hattie. In my grandfather's handwriting. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was heavy. I opened it. Inside was a letter, a thick stack of papers behind the letter, and what looked like a small leather-bound notebook tucked at the back. I unfolded the letter. It was dated the week before he died. It said this: Hattie, if you're reading this, you came. I knew you would. I'm sorry I can't be there to see you walk through the door. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry I couldn't get you out sooner. I tried, child. I went to a lawyer about taking you in when you were 15. He told me I didn't have a chance against your father unless your father agreed. And your father, God love him, wasn't going to agree to anything Linda told him not to. So I did the next best thing I could think of. I started saving for you. Not money. Money runs out. I started saving things. The shop has done a strange business for 41 years. People come in to pawn what they need to pawn, but sometimes they come in with things they don't understand the value of. A watch their granddaddy left them. A coin they found in a drawer. A painting that was rolled up in their grandmother's attic. They want $50 for it because they need $50. I give them $50, and I write them a fare ticket, and if they come back, I give them their item. They almost never come back, Hattie. After 90 days the item is mine to sell. I sold most of them, regular pawnshop business. That's what kept the lights on. But the special ones, the ones that mattered, I kept. I kept them for you. I have not always been an honest man. I want you to know that. I have cut corners, and I have made deals, and I have done things I'm not proud of. But I never cheated a soul on these. Every item in this room was offered to me, fair and square, by someone who didn't want it. I gave them what they asked for, and the law says it's mine, and now the law says it's yours. The notebook in the envelope tells you what each piece is, and where it came from, and what I think it might be worth. I had a man come up from the city last year to look at the most important pieces. He didn't see all of them. He saw enough. He told me what he told me, and you can read it in the notebook, and you will probably not believe it at first. Take your time. The shop is paid up through the end of the year. The back taxes are settled. You have a roof and you have time. Use both. I love you, Hattie. I always have. Your mother would be proud of who you are. I have been proud of you every day of your life. Granddad. I read it 3 times. I read it until the words stopped meaning anything and were just shapes on the page. Then I set it down and I picked up the notebook and I opened it to the first page and I started reading. The notebook was a careful catalog. Each entry had a number, a description, a date when my grandfather had taken it in, the name of the person who'd pawned it, the amount he'd paid, and a column on the right side with what looked like estimates of value. The estimates were in his handwriting, but some of them had been added later in a different ink, neater, more deliberate, with notations like verified and underestimate, see appraisal. I read down the first page. A pocket watch, gold case, 1923, taken in 1987 for $40, estimated value $4,000. A set of silver candlesticks, late 1800s, taken in 1991 for $60, estimated value $2,000. A wedding ring with a 1-carat diamond, taken in 1994 for $200, estimated value $6,000. I turned the page. The numbers got bigger. A pair of antique dueling pistols. A first edition of a book I'd never heard of. A A signed baseball from a player I'd never heard of who, according to the note, had been a Hall of Famer. A small painting, watercolor, dated, signed indistinctly, suspected attribution see appraiser notes. Estimated value if attribution confirmed 60,000. I turned the page again. I turned it again. The notebook had 97 entries in it, and by the time I'd read all the way through it, the sun had moved across the front windows of the shop and the bulb in the back room had started to flicker. I sat there in the chair my grandfather had probably sat in many times, and I held a notebook that said I was holding. In this single small room behind a hidden door in a pawnshop on a quiet street in a town I'd never been to, something with a low estimated value of just over $600,000 and a high estimated value, if the appraisal notes were correct on the major pieces, of significantly more. I didn't even know how to think about it. I was 19. The night before, my stepmother had thrown me out into the rain. That morning, I had bought a bus ticket with cash because my debit card had $3 on it. I had eaten a single granola bar in the last 24 hours. The number at the bottom of the last page of the notebook, in my grandfather's careful handwriting, was a number I had only ever seen on television in shows about people whose lives I had nothing to do with. I set the notebook down. I stood up. My legs almost gave out, and I had to grab the back of the chair. I walked around the small room very slowly. I touched the boxes, but I didn't open them. I wasn't ready. I went back through the metal door, and I closed it behind me, and I locked it with the key, and I pushed the cabinet back in front of it, because that was what my grandfather had done, and I wasn't ready to do anything different yet. Then I went out to the front of the shop and I sat down on the floor behind the counter because I didn't trust myself to stand up anymore. And I put my head in my hands and I started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you do when your whole life turns inside out in 12 hours and you don't know what else to do with your face. I laughed until I cried, and I cried until I laughed again. And I sat there on the floor of my grandfather's pawnshop until Gus tapped on the front window and asked if I was all right, and I called back that I was, even though I wasn't, even though I was something I didn't have a word for yet. He came in anyway. He brought a bag with a sandwich and an apple and a bottle of water in it, because he was the kind of person who knew that a 19-year-old who'd been crying for 16 hours probably hadn't eaten. He set the bag on the counter and didn't ask me what I'd found in the back. He must have wondered. He didn't ask. He said, "There's a room above the shop. Floyd lived up there when he was first divorced. It's nothing fancy, but it's got a bed and a bathroom, and the heater works. I cleaned it out a little after he died. Nobody's been up there since. Stairs are through that door." He pointed at a door I hadn't noticed, tucked behind a tall display case. "Keys on the same ring as the one you have for the front." He paused, and then he said, "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about, Hattie. But you do have to eat, and you do have to sleep. Tonight, you eat the sandwich, and you go upstairs, and you sleep. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's next. Just tomorrow. Not the rest of your life. Just tomorrow." I nodded because I couldn't speak. He patted my shoulder, and he left. I ate the sandwich. I ate the apple. I drank the water. I went upstairs and I found a small clean apartment with a quilt on the bed that smelled like my grandfather, and I lay down on top of it without taking my boots off, and I slept for 14 hours straight, and I did not dream about anything at all. The first week was the hardest, not because anything bad happened, but because nothing bad happened, and I didn't know how to be in a place where nothing bad was happening. I kept waiting for the floor to drop out. I kept waiting for Linda to walk through the door and tell me I'd been given the wrong key. I'd lived for so long in a house where I had to track everyone's mood, where the wrong sentence at dinner could mean 2 weeks of cold silence, where my father's eyes would drift right past me at the breakfast table like I was furniture, that the simple fact of waking up in a quiet room and going downstairs and making coffee without anyone watching me felt like a trick. I cried a lot that first week. Not the desperate crying from the bus station, just a low constant leaking out of my eyes whenever I wasn't paying attention. I'd be sweeping the floor of the shop, and I'd realize my face was wet, and I wouldn't even know when it had started. Gus came by every morning. He'd bring 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. the good one with the laminated menus, and we'd sit on stools behind the counter, and he'd tell me stories about my grandfather. About how Floyd had once bought a parrot from a man who couldn't pay his rent, and then spent 6 months teaching the parrot to say $2.50, because that was what Floyd thought everything in the shop should cost. About how Floyd had loaned money to half of Bowdrie at one time or another and never charged interest to anyone he liked. About my grandmother, who I'd never met, who had died of cancer the year my father was born, and how my grandfather had raised my father by himself in the apartment upstairs, and how the day my father got married the first time, to my mother, Floyd had wept in the back room because he was so proud and so lonely all at once. I learned things about my family I hadn't known. I learned my mother had loved my grandfather and had brought me up to see him every summer until she got sick. I learned that the year my mother died, Floyd had driven down 4 times to try to see me, and Linda, who was not yet my stepmother but was already in the picture, had turned him away at the door twice, and my father had let her. I learned that Floyd had paid for my mother's headstone because my father couldn't afford it, but had been too proud to admit he couldn't afford it, and Floyd had handled it quietly so my father would never have to know. I cried about all of these things, separately, in the back room, where Gus couldn't see me. The shop itself was a mess. The front of the shop, I mean. The display cases were mostly empty, and the ones that weren't empty had inventory that had been sitting there for years gathering dust. The cash register didn't work. The card reader, which Floyd had apparently bought in a fit of optimism in 2018, had never been activated. The accounts at the bank had been frozen since his death and would require a court appearance to unfreeze, which Gus said his lawyer friend could help with for free because he owed Floyd a favor from 20 years ago. There were utility bills stacked on the counter that had been paid by a service Floyd had set up before he died, and the service was running out, and I needed to deal with that in the next 90 days. The roof leaked over the back corner of the shop. The sign out front needed repainting. The display window had a long crack running diagonally across the upper pane. It was overwhelming, all of it, and for the first 3 days I didn't touch any of it. I just sat in the shop and let myself be in a building that belonged to me. On the 4th day, I started cleaning. I cleaned because I didn't know what else to do, and because the dust was making me sneeze, and because something in me needed to do something with my hands. I started at the front, with the display window, and I worked my way back. I washed every glass case inside and out. I polished the brass on the cash register until it shone. I swept the floor, mopped it, swept it again. I took the inventory that was still in the cases and laid it out on the counter and tried to make sense of it. There were maybe 20 items out front, the kind of things you'd expect in a pawn shop. Watches, jewelry, 2 guitars, a saxophone, a violin in a hard case, a stack of vintage cameras, some power tools. None of it was particularly valuable. None of it was particularly worthless either. It was the regular business, the legitimate front. I dusted each piece and put it back in the case and made a list with prices, using my grandfather's notebook to estimate where I could and my own guesses where I couldn't. I worked on the front of the shop for 4 days. I didn't open the back room again. I wasn't ready. I needed to be the kind of person who could walk into that back room and look at the contents of it without feeling like I was going to throw up, and I wasn't that person yet. On the 5th day, a man came in. I'd unlocked the front door that morning out of habit, more than anything. I wasn't open for business. The sign in the window still said closed and the lights inside were low. But the door had been unlocked, and around 2 in the afternoon, the bell over the door jangled, and a man walked in. He was middle-aged, in his 50s maybe, wearing a wool coat that was too nice for Mercer Street. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the shop with an expression I couldn't read. Then he saw me behind the counter, and his face changed, and he smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Floyd's granddaughter," he said. I was hoping someone would come. I didn't say anything. I had spent enough years around Linda to know that when someone walks into a room smiling at you like that, the safest thing you can do is wait. He took a step further in, looked at the cleaned glass cases, ran a finger along the edge of the counter, and rubbed it with his thumb to check for dust. There wasn't any. I had spent 4 days on that counter. "You've been busy," he said. Floyd would have appreciated it. He was particular about his shop. "Who are you?" My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "Forgive me. My name is Roland Pace. I knew your grandfather. We did business together for a number of years." He set the leather satchel down on the counter, not aggressively, just like he was settling in. "I'm an appraiser. Specialize in coins, fine collectibles, that sort of thing. Floyd used to call me when he needed something looked at. We had what you might call an arrangement." I didn't touch the satchel. I didn't move. What kind of arrangement? I'd come up to Bowdrie 2 or 3 times a year, look at whatever he'd taken in that he thought might be of interest, give him an honest valuation. He'd consign the better pieces with me for resale. I have a small auction house in the city. We did very well together for almost 15 years. He smiled again. I was sorry to hear about his passing. I was out of the country when it happened. I would have come to the funeral. I wasn't at the funeral either. That seemed to throw him for a second. He recovered fast. "Well, that makes 2 of us, then." I came back about 3 months after, but the shop was locked up tight, and the lawyer wouldn't tell me anything. He said the estate was complicated. I left my card. I never heard from anyone. I just got here last week. "I see." He looked around the shop again, more carefully this time. "May I ask, Miss Reeves, have you had a chance to inventory what your grandfather left?" There were several pieces he was holding when I last saw him that I'd been very interested in. I'd love to take another look, with an eye toward perhaps continuing the arrangement we had. "I think your grandfather would have wanted his work to continue, don't you?" Everything he said was polite. Everything he said was reasonable. I didn't like a single word of it. I had grown up with Linda. I knew the texture of someone who wanted something from me dressed up as someone who was doing me a favor. The way she'd say, "Hattie, sweetheart, I'm just trying to help you," right before she did something that hurt. Roland Pace had that same texture. The smile that stopped at his mouth. The eyes that kept moving around the shop while he talked to me, checking corners, checking the door behind the counter, checking the door behind that. "I haven't done a full inventory yet," I said. "I've only been here a few days." Of course. It must be overwhelming. Perhaps I could help. Free of charge, naturally, just as a favor to Floyd's memory. I could come back tomorrow with my equipment, and we could go through the shop together. I could tell you what's valuable and what isn't, what might fetch a good price at auction. It would save you weeks of work. He was already pulling a business card out of his pocket. He slid it across the counter toward me. The card was thick, expensive, off-white with raised black letters. Roland Pace, Pace & Company. Appraisers, EST 1994. A phone number, an address in the city. Think about it, Miss Reeves. You're young. You've come into a property you didn't ask for. You probably have a life waiting for you somewhere else. The fastest way to liquidate this and move on is to work with someone who knows the market. I am that someone. I'll think about it. Please do. He held my eyes for a beat too long. I'll be in town until Friday. You have my number. I do hope to hear from you. He picked up his satchel and walked out. The bell over the door jangled. I stood behind the counter without moving for a full minute. Then I went to the front door, locked it, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the shade. I sat down on the floor behind the counter, and I shook. I shook for maybe 5 minutes, until my hands stopped doing it on their own. Then I got up and I went next door. Gus was finishing up with a customer when I walked in. He took one look at my face and sent the customer out the door with a free promise of a touch-up next week. He sat me down in his barber chair, the same one he'd put me in my first morning, and he said, "Who was it?" "A man named Roland Pace." He said he was an appraiser. He said he and Granddad had an arrangement. Gus's face went through several things at once. None of them were good. He sat down in the chair next to mine and rubbed his jaw. "Roland Pace," he said. "Yeah, I remember Roland Pace." Was he telling the truth about the arrangement? He was telling part of the truth. Your grandfather did business with him for a while. Then about 4 years ago, Floyd stopped doing business with him. Stopped abruptly. He never told me why, exactly. But he told me once, late one night when we'd had a couple of drinks, that Roland Pace had tried to cheat him on a piece. A coin, I think. Pace had given him a valuation that was about a third of what the coin was actually worth, sold it at auction, kept the difference. Floyd caught him. Floyd was a slow man to anger, Hattie, but when he got there, he stayed there. He told Pace to never come back. Pace came back anyway, once or twice. Tried to make peace. Floyd ran him off. I sat with that. He told me he was out of the country when Granddad died. He might have been, or he might have been waiting. Gus looked at me steadily. Hattie, there was talk in town. After your grandfather passed, people said he had things in that shop. Valuable things. Floyd was careful about it, didn't show anyone, didn't brag. But people knew. The town knew Floyd had a backroom. A man like Roland Pace, who'd been doing business with Floyd for years and got cut off without an explanation. He would have been thinking about that backroom every day since the funeral. Probably stopped by 100 times trying to find a way in. And now you've shown up. A young woman, alone, with no one around to advise her. He's going to come at you, child. He's already coming at you. I felt very cold. What do? First thing, you don't let him through the door again. You don't take his calls. You don't sign anything he puts in front of you. Anything you find in that back room, Hattie, you don't show to him. Not one piece. He'll lowball you on everything. He'll tell you it's worth 1/10 of what it's worth. He'll offer to take it off your hands. You say no. Every time. You say no. Okay. Second thing, you need a real appraiser. Honest one. Floyd had a man he started working with after he cut Pace off. Name was Wendell Yates. Had a shop down in Charlotte. He's older than dirt and twice as honest. Floyd trusted him. I have his number somewhere. I'll dig it out tonight. Okay. Third thing. Gus paused. Third thing, child, is you need to understand that if Roland Pace knows the shop's got things in it, other people know too. Some of them might be patient. Some of them might not. You're going to want to think about not advertising. Don't tell anyone what you find. Don't tell anyone what's worth what. Don't tell anyone you've even opened the back. The people who matter, you'll know who they are because they'll already know. The people who don't matter, they don't need to know anything. I nodded. He looked at me for a long moment, and his eyes got softer. I'm sorry, Hattie. I know this isn't what you came here looking for. I know you came here looking for a place to land, and instead you've landed in something complicated. But you're not alone in it. You hear me? You're not alone. I hear you. I went back to the shop. I locked everything. I went upstairs to the apartment, and I sat on the bed for a long time. And I called the number my grandfather's lawyer had on the original letter, and I left a message saying I was here, I was Hattie Reeves, and I needed to talk to someone about the estate. Then I sat on the bed some more. I thought about what Gus had said. I thought about Roland Pace's card, which was still on the counter downstairs, and his too long stare, and the way he'd called me Miss Reeves like he was reminding himself who I was and what I was worth to him. I thought about my father, who'd never once in 19 years called me Miss anything. I thought about Linda, and the way she would have heard the news of where I was if she'd heard it. I hadn't told her. I hadn't told my father. As far as the people who'd raised me knew, I had disappeared off the planet 5 days ago, and not one of them had picked up a phone to find out where I'd gone. I went downstairs. I locked the front door of the shop a second time, just to be sure. I went into the back room, the regular back room. I pulled the cabinet away from the metal door. I put the key in the lock. This time my hands didn't shake. I opened the door. I turned on the light. I sat down at the small table in the center of the room, and I opened the notebook to the first page. And I started to learn what my grandfather had left me. I worked through that night and most of the next day. I didn't open most of the boxes. I just read, slowly, every entry in the notebook. I matched up numbers with the items on the shelves. Some of the items I could identify by the description on the outside of the box. Others I had to take down and unwrap a little, carefully, with shaking fingers, to confirm what they were. There was a small flat case on the third shelf, marked Entry 47. The notebook said, Tiffany Silver Tea Service, 6 pieces, late 19th century, taken from Mrs. Eldrada Marsh in 1996 against a loan of $140 to pay her late husband's funeral costs. Mrs. Marsh died 8 months later without redeeming. Said appraised by Yates in 2021 as authentic, complete, in excellent condition. Estimated auction value $8,000 to $12,000. I lifted the case down. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tarnish-resistant cloth, was a teapot and matching pieces, silver gone soft and dark from years of neglect, but with the maker's mark still visible underneath. I held the teapot in both hands, and I thought about Eldrada Marsh, whoever she had been, sitting in this shop in 1996 in her widow's clothes asking my grandfather for $140 so she could bury her husband. I thought about my grandfather giving her the money and writing her a fare ticket and her never coming back. I wrapped the teapot in its cloth and put it back in the case and put the case back on the shelf. There was a long flat wooden box on the bottom shelf, marked entry 71. The notebook said, Civil War Officer's Saber, Presentation Grade, Etched Blade, Ivory Grip, in original scabbard. Brought in by Cyrus Mooney in 2009, claimed to have belonged to his great-grandfather, against a loan of $200 for medical bills. Mooney passed in 2010 without redeeming. Saber appraised in 2021. Authentic. Original presentation engraving identifies a regiment that saw action at Gettysburg. Estimated auction value if engraving verifies provenance, $35,000 to $50,000. I didn't open that one. I just looked at the box and then put my hand on top of it and said, Mr. Mooney, I'm sorry about your great-grandfather. To no one. There were tubes of canvas leaning against the back wall. The notebook had 3 entries for them. Entry 63. Oil on canvas, framed when received, frame removed for storage, signed lower right, illegible. Brought in 2014 by Anthony Pell against a loan of $300 to settle his sister's hospital debt. Yates examined this in 2021. He believes, but cannot confirm without further testing, that the work is by a known American regionalist active in the 1930s. If attribution holds, estimated auction value, somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. If attribution does not hold, value still in the low 5 figures because the work itself is well executed. I read that one twice. I didn't touch the tubes. I left them where they were. The safe in the corner had a combination lock. The notebook had a page in the back, on a piece of paper folded in half, with the combination written in my grandfather's hand. I didn't open the safe that day either. I wasn't ready for whatever was in it. I closed the notebook. I locked the metal door. I pushed the cabinet back in front of it. I went out to the front of the shop, and I sat on a stool behind the counter, and I waited for my heart to slow down. I waited a long time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 3 days later, Wendell Yates drove up from Charlotte. He was 81 years old. He drove a brown sedan that was older than I was. He wore a tweed jacket over a buttoned-up cardigan and a hat that he took off when he came through the door and held against his chest. He looked at me for a long moment, and then his eyes filled up, and he said, "You look like your grandmother." I made him coffee. He sat in a chair near the front window with the coffee balanced on his knee, and he asked me how I was. Not how the shop was, not how the inventory was. How I was. I told him I was all right. He nodded like that was the right answer and the wrong answer at the same time. "Floyd told me about you," he said. "He talked about you every time I came up. Every time. He said you were the smartest child he'd ever met. He said your mother had raised you right, and that whatever happened next in your life, you'd handle it." His voice was steady, but his hands shook a little on the coffee cup. "I'm sorry I'm only meeting you now. I'm sorry it took this. He should have been here." "Me too," I said. He pulled himself together. He set the coffee on the windowsill, and he opened his briefcase and pulled out a leather notebook of his own. "Floyd called me about 18 months before he passed," he said. "Asked me to come up and do a proper appraisal on the back room. The serious pieces. I came up over a long weekend. We worked through every item he'd flagged. I gave him my best estimates. I told him what would need additional verification and what wouldn't. He paid me my fee, in cash, like he always did. We had a long dinner that night. He told me what he was planning. He told me about you." Wendell paused and looked out the window for a second. He asked me, if anything happened to him, would I come back when you were ready? Would I help you sort it out? Do the additional verifications, find the right buyers. He said he'd left me a letter with my fee paid in advance. I told him I'd come for free, but he wouldn't have it. Floyd always paid his bills. I had to look at the floor for a minute. Wendell let me. Miss Reeves. Hattie, please. Hattie, I'd like to start tomorrow morning, if that suits you. I can be here at 9. I'd like to take a more thorough look at the high-value pieces, particularly the canvases and the saber and a few of the coins. The pieces that need provenance work. I can do most of the documentation here, but a few items will need to go out to specialists for testing. Always with paperwork. Always with chain of custody. Nothing leaves this shop without you knowing exactly where it's going, who has it, and when it's coming back. Is that acceptable? Yes. Good. I should also tell you. Roland Pace called me yesterday. I went still. He did. He did. He's a man I have known for 30 years, and not liked for 25 of them. He called to inform me, in his friendly way, that Floyd Reeves's heir had finally arrived in Bowdrie, and that he, Roland, was working with her to dispose of the inventory. He wanted to confirm what I knew about the major pieces. He said he wanted to make sure she got a fair deal. Wendell smiled a little. It was not a kind smile. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. I told him I hadn't spoken to anyone in the Reeves family in years. I told him I was retired and wished him well. Then I hung up and I got in the car and drove up here. Will he know you came? Possibly. Bowdrie is not a large town. If he asks around, he'll know. But he won't be able to do anything about it. Hattie, you need to understand. Roland Pace can talk. He can pressure. He can lie. He cannot physically take anything from this shop. He has no legal standing. The shop and everything in it belongs to you, free and clear. Your grandfather made sure of that. The worst Pace can do is be a nuisance. As long as you don't sign anything he puts in front of you, he can't touch a single thing. I nodded. I think I was nodding too much. Wendell saw it. I'll be here at 9 tomorrow, he said. Get some sleep tonight, Hattie. We have a lot of work ahead. He worked with me for the next 2 weeks. He came up Tuesday through Saturday and went home to Charlotte on Sunday and Monday. He stayed at the small inn at the end of Mercer Street, which had a single guest room that was usually empty. The innkeeper, a woman named Roxanne, knew Wendell from years before and refused to charge him more than $30 a night, which Wendell pretended to argue about and then accepted. We worked in the back room with the door locked and the cabinet pulled fully aside. Wendell taught me how to handle each piece. He taught me how to lift a canvas without putting pressure on the painted surface, how to support an old book by its spine, how to wear cotton gloves for some things and not for others. He showed me what to look for. The maker's marks, the provenance papers, the wear patterns. That distinguished an authentic Victorian silver service from a clever reproduction. I learned more in those 2 weeks than I had learned in any 2 weeks of my life. The notebook my grandfather had kept had been thorough, but it had also been conservative. Wendell's estimates, going back over each piece with fresh eyes and 3 more years of market data, were higher on most items. Not wildly higher, just higher. The teapot in entry 47 was now estimated at $12,000 to $15,000 because demand for 19th century American silver had quietly climbed. The saber was confirmed in its provenance after Wendell made some phone calls to a Civil War historian he knew, and was now estimated at $55,000 to $70,000. The 3 canvases were the big ones. Wendell took one of them down to the city for testing, with a chain of custody form I had signed, and he had countersigned and Gus had witnessed. He came back 10 days later and laid the paperwork on the table in front of me and said, Hattie, the attribution holds. The work is by who your grandfather thought it was. The painter died in 1953. His works are in 3 major museum collections. This piece, this single canvas, is being conservatively estimated by the testing facility at $190,000. Pending auction, it could go higher. I sat with that for a long minute. The other 2? Still pending. But if this one is what we think, the other 2 are likely in the same range. Together, the 3 canvases, at conservative estimate, will bring you somewhere between $500,000 and $800,000 at auction. I had to put my head down on the table. I just put my head down on my arms and I stayed there for a while. Wendell didn't say anything. He waited. When I lifted my head, I said, "Wendell, what's in the safe?" "I haven't opened the safe yet, Hattie. You haven't asked me to." "Will you open it with me?" "Yes." We opened the safe that afternoon. The combination was the one written in the notebook. The safe opened easily, like the metal door had, like everything in this room had been kept oiled and maintained by my grandfather right up until the day he died. Inside the safe were 5 smaller boxes and a thick brown envelope. Wendell took the envelope first because he saw the writing on it. It was for me. From Granddad. A second letter. He handed it to me and stepped back. I opened it slowly. Inside were several documents and a much shorter letter. The letter said, "Hattie, if you're reading this, you've opened the safe, which means Wendell got here and you decided to trust him, which is good because you should. The papers in this envelope are the deeds to the building, both the shop and the apartment above it. They are yours. They have been yours since the day you were born. Your grandmother and I bought this building in 1981, and we agreed that if we ever had a granddaughter, she would have it. Your grandmother died before you were born, but she made me promise. I am keeping that promise. The boxes in the safe are pieces I never showed Wendell. I am sorry to spring them on him now. The reason I didn't show him is not because I didn't trust him. It's because I wanted these to be a surprise for you. I wanted there to be something in this room that no one else had touched, and no one else had counted, and no one else had told you what it was worth. I wanted you to be the first person to see them since I put them away. They are nothing special, just 5 pieces. But they are yours alone. Open the boxes one at a time. Take your time. Don't rush. I love you, Granddad." I opened the boxes one at a time. Wendell waited at the table. He didn't lean forward. He didn't crane his neck. He just sat in his chair and watched my face and let me have my moments. The first box held a strand of pearls. Long, double strand, with a clasp that had a small inscription on it. The inscription said E.M., who I would learn later was Edna May, my grandmother. The pearls had been hers. The second box held a man's pocket watch. Inscribed inside the case were the words, "To Floyd, on our 10th. Love always, Edna." She had given it to him for their 10th anniversary. He had carried it every day of his life after she died. I remembered seeing it in his pocket the last time I'd visited him. The third box held a single gold ring with a small ruby in it. Inscribed inside the band was my mother's name, Marigold, and a date. It was the ring my grandfather had given my mother on her 18th birthday, before she ever met my father, when she had still been his little girl. The fourth box held a stack of letters tied with a piece of ribbon. Letters from my mother to my grandfather. Dozens of them, from the years before she got sick. She'd written to him every month. I hadn't known. The fifth box held a small, very ordinary-looking gold coin. There was a piece of paper folded under it. The paper was in my grandfather's handwriting. It said, "This one I bought myself, with my own money, in 1979. It's an 1849 Liberty head, mint condition. I had it appraised by Wendell in private last year. He doesn't know it's in here. He told me, without knowing what coin we were talking about because I was being cagey, that an 1849 Liberty head in mint condition currently fetches around $220,000 at auction. Hattie, this one is just for you. Not for the estate. Not for the auction. This one is for whatever you need it to be for. Sell it if you need to sell it. Keep it if you need to keep it. Either way, it's yours. I love you, Granddad." I put the coin back in its box. I closed the box. I closed the safe. I went out to the front of the shop, and I walked out the door, and I walked down Mercer Street toward the river without telling anyone where I was going. Wendell didn't follow me. He was the kind of man who knew when to follow somebody and when not to. I walked all the way down to the river. I sat on a bench at the end of the boardwalk, and I looked at the water for a long time. The river in Bowdrie is narrow and brown and pretty in the way old rivers are pretty, with hawthorn trees leaning over the banks and an iron bridge a half-mile downstream that's been painted the same dark red for 100 years. I sat there until the sun started going down. I cried some. I didn't cry the whole time. Mostly I just sat and tried to feel the size of what was happening to me. My grandfather had loved me. He had loved me for 19 years. He had loved me from before I was born, when my grandmother had made him promise the building would be mine someday. He had loved me through every Christmas I hadn't seen him, and every birthday Linda had thrown away the card. He had loved me through the years when I thought everyone in my family had forgotten about me. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't been able to come and get me, because the law wouldn't let him, but he had been working. The whole time, in the back of his shop, on a quiet street in a town I'd never been to, he had been working, building me something, building me a way out. The week after we opened the safe, Linda found me. I don't know how she did it. The lawyer, probably. Floyd's lawyer had needed to file some papers in the county where I'd grown up, transferring the deed, and Linda probably saw the filing. Or maybe my father got curious and asked. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that on a Wednesday morning in early November, I was sweeping the front of the shop when I looked up and saw Linda standing on the other side of the door. She was wearing the wool coat she wore in winter and a knit hat she'd made herself. She was holding a casserole dish. I'm not making that up. She had driven 260 miles to find me, and she had brought a casserole. I stood with the broom in my hand. I didn't move. Linda smiled at me through the glass and held up the casserole dish a little, like she was waiting for me to invite her in. I didn't unlock the door. We stood there for almost a full minute, looking at each other through the glass. Finally, Linda mimed for me to come closer, and I walked to the door, and I cracked it open about 4 inches and stood in the gap. Hattie, sweetheart, why are you here? I've been so worried about you. She was using the voice. The Sunday school voice. The voice she used at her women's group when she was telling someone how proud she was of them in a way that made it clear she wasn't. Your father and I have been beside ourselves. We didn't know where you went. You knew where I went. You told me to go. That was a misunderstanding, sweetheart. That was a moment. You know how things get. I came up here to bring you home. Your father misses you. Did he come with you? He couldn't get away from work. She didn't even pause before she said it. But he sends his love. I bet he does. I leaned on the door frame. I was tired. I was so tired, all of a sudden, looking at her. I'd been awake at 5 that morning to help Wendell catalog a set of coins. I'd been sleeping 6 hours a night for 3 weeks because my brain wouldn't stop running. I was 19 years old, and the woman who'd thrown me out of my house was standing on the sidewalk with a casserole pretending none of it had happened. Linda. Yes, honey. What do you want? She kept smiling. Her face did the thing it always did when she was about to pivot, the slight tightening around the eyes that she didn't know I could see. I just want to talk, Hattie. May I come in? I drove a long way. We can talk here. It's cold out here. We can talk here. She lowered the casserole dish. The smile stayed, but it had nothing behind it now. Fine. We can talk here. Hattie, your grandfather's lawyer contacted your father last week. It seems Floyd left you this property and some inventory. Your father was upset that he wasn't informed earlier, but more than that, he's concerned. Honey, this isn't a place for a young girl to be by herself. You don't know the first thing about running a business. You don't know anything about pawnshops. There are bills, there are taxes, there are liabilities. Your father and I talked it over, and we think the best thing is for us to help you. We'd like to take over the property, manage the sale of the inventory, handle the proceeds. We'll put the money in trust for you. When you're a little older, you can decide what to do with it. Until then, you come home. We'll get your old room ready. I looked at her. I'd been bracing all morning for the moment she would walk in and try this, and now that it was here, it almost felt anticlimactic. It was so exactly what I expected. The trust she was offering would have her name on it. The decisions would all be made by her. The proceeds, by the time they reached me, if they ever reached me, would be a fraction of what my grandfather had spent 41 years saving up. I could see the whole thing laid out, the way she would do it, the slow, patient siphon, and I could see my father at the kitchen table signing what she put in front of him. Linda. Yes, sweetheart. Get off my sidewalk. Her face went flat. Excuse me. I said get off my sidewalk. You were standing in front of my building, holding a casserole, asking me to give you control of a property my grandfather left to me specifically because he knew you would try this. You threw me out into the rain 3 weeks ago. My father pulled the curtains shut while I was crying on the street. I have not heard from him since. You haven't called me. You haven't texted me. You did not file a missing persons report. You waited until you found out there was money, and then you drove up here with a green bean casserole. Get off my sidewalk. Linda stood there. The casserole dish was at her side now. The smile was completely gone. For a second I saw what she looked like with all her layers off, the woman my father had married. And what was underneath was a hard, small person who had wanted what she wanted and had not been particular about how she got it. She said, "You ungrateful little brat." "Yeah," I said. "I am." I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt. I pulled the shade. Then I walked into the back of the shop and I sat down on the floor and I laughed. Not the broken laugh from my first day. A real one. A short, surprised, almost embarrassed laugh, like I'd just done something I'd been waiting 19 years to do and didn't know I was capable of. Gus came over an hour later. He said Linda had stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes after I closed the door, then she'd come into the barber shop and tried to convince him to talk sense into me. He said he'd told her he was busy with a customer and didn't have time. He said the customer had been him, alone, drinking coffee. He said it had been one of the better mornings of his recent life. He also said I should expect Linda to come back. She wouldn't give up that easily. I should expect lawyers. I should expect letters. I should expect, eventually, my father to call. "Are you ready for that?" Gus asked. I thought about it. I thought about my father. I thought about the man who had sat at the breakfast table when I was 8 years old and braided my hair before school because my mother had been too sick to do it. I thought about the man who had not opened the curtains for 19 days while I cried in my room after my mother's funeral. I thought about the man who had not come outside in the rain when Linda put me on the curb. "I'm ready," I said. I wasn't, but I was getting there. The first of Wendell's auctions was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. He'd lined up a regional house in Atlanta that specialized in fine and decorative arts, and they'd agreed to feature the 3 canvases, the Sabre, and the Silver Tea Service together as part of their winter sale. There would be smaller sales after that, through other channels, for the coins and the watch and the books and the jewelry. Wendell estimated that by the end of the following summer, every piece in the back room would be sold or placed, the documentation completed, the proceeds in my account minus his fees and the auction house's commissions. He'd quoted me an end estimate, low side, of around $1 million. High side, if the canvases performed at the top of their range and the Sabre set a new record for Civil War officer pieces of its grade, closer to 2. He kept reminding me these were estimates. He kept reminding me that auctions could disappoint. He kept reminding me not to spend $1 of it in my head until it was in my hand. I was good about that. I was 19, and I had grown up with very little money, and I was not in any hurry to imagine myself rich. What I was in a hurry to do was make sure the shop survived. The pawnshop itself, the legitimate front, had been losing money for the last 2 years of my grandfather's life because he had been sick and not running it the way he used to. I didn't want to close it. I wanted to reopen it. I wanted to honor what he had built. So I started learning. Gus had a cousin who'd run a pawn shop in Asheville for 30 years. The cousin came up for a weekend at Gus's request, looked at my books, looked at my inventory, and gave me a crash course in how the business actually worked. The licensing requirements, the state regulations about firearms and precious metals, the record keeping, the hold periods, the relationships with local police. I took notes. I asked questions. I made him repeat things. He left me with a binder of his own templates and a phone number I could call if I had questions. I started studying. I read everything I could find about appraising, about jewelry, about coins, about antique watches. I took an online course in business management from a community college and paid the $75 fee out of my own pocket. I started keeping the shop open 3 days a week, just to see what would happen. The first day I opened, nobody came in. The second day, 3 people came in. By the second week, I'd taken in my first piece, a man's wedding band from a fellow named Peter Tull who needed $60 to fix his truck. I gave him $60. I wrote him a fare ticket. He came back 2 weeks later and redeemed it. He shook my hand on the way out and said, "Floyd would be glad." I cried a little after he left. Not much, just a little. And then on a cold morning in mid-December, the day after the first real snow, I was sweeping the front step when a car pulled up across the street. I didn't recognize it. I kept sweeping. The driver's side door opened. My father got out. I stopped sweeping. He stood by the car for a second with his hand on the open door, like he wasn't sure he was going to commit to getting out. He looked older than I remembered. He'd lost weight. His coat was the same coat he'd worn for the last 10 winters, the gray one with the worn cuffs. He shut the door. He crossed the street slowly, looking down at the curb, and then up at the shop sign, and then at me. He stopped about 4 feet away. Hattie, Dad. Neither of us moved. The snow was still on the ground from the day before, dirty along the curb where the salt trucks had been, white in the patches the trucks had missed. My breath was visible. His was too. Linda doesn't know I'm here, he said. Okay. I told her I had a sales call in Greensboro. Okay. He looked at his shoes. He was wearing the dress shoes he wore to work. They were not the right shoes for walking on a salted sidewalk in December. I don't know what I'm doing. Here, Hattie. Okay. Could we go inside? I thought about it for a long minute. I thought about every reason I had to keep the door locked. I thought about how I'd promised myself, the night Linda left with her casserole, that I would not be soft for people who had not been soft for me. I thought about my grandfather and what he would have said. I unlocked the door. I let my father in. I didn't make him coffee. I didn't sit him down. We stood at the front of the shop with the counter between us. He looked around the place, at the cleaned cases, at the new inventory I'd taken in over the last 6 weeks, at the cash register that I'd had repaired by a man in town who fixed old machines as a hobby. He looked at all of it, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do in years. It got soft. Your grandfather kept it nice, he said. I'm keeping it nice. Yes, you are. He cleared his throat. Hattie, I owe you an apology. I owe you about 100 apologies, and I don't know which one to start with. Don't start with any of them. What? Don't apologize. Not yet. Apologies are easy. Tell me something true first. He stood there. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked at the floor and then at me. Your mother would not have let her in the house, he said. I know. She would not have. Marigold would have seen Linda in 5 minutes and walked her to the door. I knew that. I knew it the whole time. I told myself I was lonely, and I told myself you needed a mother, and I told myself a lot of things. But underneath all of it, I knew what Marigold would have done, and I did not do it. No, I did not do it. His voice cracked on the second time he said it. I did not do it, and you paid for it. You paid for it for 7 years, Hattie. You paid for it every day, and I watched you pay for it. And I let it happen because I didn't want to fight her. Because fighting her would have meant admitting I'd been wrong. And I couldn't admit I'd been wrong. And so I just let her do whatever she was going to do. And I told myself it would even out. It did not even out. No, it did not. He had to stop talking for a second. He took his hands out of his pockets and rubbed his face with both of them. The night she put you out, Hattie, I want you to know, I sat in that house after you were gone, and I did not sleep. Not 1 minute. I sat in the kitchen until the sun came up and Linda came down and made coffee and asked me what I wanted for breakfast like nothing had happened. Like you weren't out there somewhere. Like we hadn't just watched a child carry her things into the rain. And I sat at that table, and I ate the eggs she made me, and I went to work, and I have not had 1 good hour since. Why didn't you call me? Because I was a coward, Hattie. I have been a coward for 7 years, and I did not know how to stop being one in one phone call. I told myself you needed time. I told myself you'd reach out when you were ready. I told myself a lot of things. None of them were true. The truth is I was afraid of what you would say to me, and I was afraid that what you would say to me would be the truth, and I did not want to hear the truth, because if I heard the truth, I would have to do something about it, and I didn't know how. I stood behind the counter, and I watched him cry. He cried quietly, the way men of his generation cried, with his shoulders held still and his face turned a little away. He didn't try to come around the counter. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He just stood there in his wrong shoes, and he let me see him. I had imagined this conversation 100 times in the last 3 months. In every version of it, I'd had a speech ready. I'd had the things I wanted to say to him lined up like cards on a table, and I had been so ready to lay them out one by one and let him sit with each one. Now he was here, and I had nothing. I had no speech. I had only the fact of him, my father, 52 years old, in a worn-out coat, weeping in front of a counter in a town he had never been to. Dad, yeah, I am not coming back. I know. I am not coming back, and I am not signing anything for Linda, and I am not letting her near this shop, and I am not letting her near any money that came from this shop. Granddad left it to me. He left it to me on purpose. He left it to me because he knew what you would do with it if he gave it to you, which is give it to her. So this is mine. Do you understand? Yes. And if you want to be in my life, you can be in my life. But it will be on my terms, in my house, on my schedule. And if you ever bring Linda within 50 miles of this shop again, we are done. Do you understand? Yes. Say it. I understand. We stood there. The snow had started up again outside. Light snow, the kind that drifts more than it falls. My father wiped his face on the back of his hand, an old gesture I remembered from when I was little. Can I see it? He said. See what? The shop. The back. Your grandfather's. Can I see what he did? I thought about it. I thought about what my grandfather would have wanted, which was not the same as what I wanted, and I decided to be a person who could do the harder thing. Come on, I said. I walked him through the back room. I didn't unlock the metal door. I didn't show him what was behind it. He had not earned that yet. But I showed him the cot where his father had slept, and the hot plate, and the bookshelf, and the calendar on the wall still turned to the month Floyd had died. The circle Gus had drawn around the date. My father stood in the middle of the back room, and he turned in a slow circle, and he said, he died here. By himself. Yes. I should have been at his funeral. Yes. I should have brought you to his funeral. Yes. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't qualify. He just took the things I was saying to him, and he let them be true. After a while he said, where do you sleep? Upstairs. There's an apartment. Can I see it? Not today. Okay. We went back out to the front of the shop. He stood by the door with his hand on the knob, and he looked at me for a long time. I'm going to call you, he said. Once a week. On Sundays. If you don't want to talk, you don't have to pick up. But I'm going to call. Okay. And I'm going to come up. Not soon. I'm not going to push it. But when you're ready. Just me. Not her. Okay. Hattie. His voice was very small. Your mother would be proud of you. I had to put my hand on the counter for a second because the floor moved a little. Thank you, I said. He left. He walked back across the street to his car, and he got in, and he sat in the driver's seat for a long minute before he started it. He looked at me through the windshield, and he raised one hand, and I raised one hand back. Then he drove away. The auction happened on the third Saturday of January, in a hotel ballroom in Atlanta that smelled like old carpet and chafing dishes. Wendell drove me down. Gus came with us. I wore a black dress I'd bought at the consignment shop in Bowdrie for $16, and a pair of second-hand boots, and my mother's gold ring with the ruby in it, the one my grandfather had left me in the safe. I sat in the third row with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched my grandfather's pieces cross the auction block one by one. The silver tea service went first. It sold for $14,500 to a woman in the front row who I later learned ran a private museum of American decorative arts. The saber went next. There were 3 bidders working on it, 2 on the phone and 1 in the room, and it climbed in $5,000 increments until the auctioneer brought his hammer down at $68,000. The room actually applauded. I didn't know rooms did that. The 3 canvases went one at a time. The first sold for $175,000. The second, the largest, sold for $240,000. The third, the smallest but the one Wendell had said was technically the finest, went into a bidding war between a museum and a private collector and finally sold for $310,000. By the time the auctioneer announced the final hammer price on the last canvas, I had stopped being able to hear the numbers properly. They were sounds. They were not connected to anything in my body. Gus reached over and squeezed my hand, and I realized I was shaking. After it was over, Wendell drove us to a steakhouse a few blocks from the hotel. The 3 of us sat in a booth, and Wendell ordered a bottle of wine, and Gus ordered a steak the size of his head, and I ordered a chicken sandwich because I didn't trust my stomach to handle anything bigger. Wendell raised his glass. To Floyd, he said. To Floyd, Gus said. To Granddad, I said. We drank. I drank water because I was 19 and Wendell, despite being an octogenarian who had just made me a wealthy person, was a stickler for rules. I sat in the booth and I watched the two old men eat and laugh and tell stories about my grandfather, stories I had never heard. And I thought, this is the closest I will ever be to him. The auction proceeds, after fees and commissions, came to just over $670,000. The smaller pieces, sold over the next 4 months through other channels, brought another 410. The coins went last, in May. In a specialty sale, Wendell handled himself out of a smaller house in Charleston. The 1849 Liberty head, my grandfather's secret one, the one he had bought himself in 1979 and put in the safe with the personal letter, sold for $245,000 to a single bidder over the phone. I cried when Wendell called me with the number. I'd been at the shop. I'd been ringing up a kid who was pawning his old guitar to buy a ring for his girlfriend, and the call had come in, and I'd had to ask the kid to give me a minute. He'd waited. When I came back to the counter, my eyes wet, he asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, and he nodded like a person who'd heard a lot of yes that weren't quite yes in his life. I gave him $40 extra on the loan, in cash, because I could. By the end of June, the back room was empty except for the small pieces my grandfather had left me personally. The pearls, the pocket watch, my mother's ring, the stack of letters, the original Liberty head, which I had decided to keep, in the end, after a long phone call with Wendell, who said it was probably the wrong financial decision and the right human one. The room itself, the small one behind the metal door, I left open after that. I didn't need to hide it anymore. I moved the cabinet permanently. I cleaned the shelves. I put up a small photograph of my grandfather, the one Gus had given me of Floyd standing in front of the shop in 1985 with a cigarette in his hand and a smile that took up his whole face. I put the photograph at eye level on the back wall, where you could see it when you walked in. I sat in the chair at the center table sometimes, just to sit. The total, after everything, every fee and commission and tax obligation, was $1,870,000. Linda came back twice. The first time was a week after the first auction, when she had presumably heard the numbers. She did not bring a casserole this time. She brought a lawyer. He was a nervous man in a suit 2 sizes too big, and he stood on the sidewalk holding a folder, and Linda stood next to him, and they tried to hand me papers through the cracked door. I did not take the papers. I closed the door. The lawyer left a copy on the step. I read them later, with Wendell's lawyer friend on the phone, and we determined that they were a request for me to intermediation regarding what Linda called family inheritance equity. Wendell's lawyer friend laughed for about 30 seconds straight when I read it to him. He told me he would draft a response, and I should sign it, and that should be the end of it. It was not the end of it. The second time Linda came back was in March. This time she came alone, and she did not bring papers. She rang the bell over the door at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, and she walked in like she belonged there, and she stopped in front of the counter. I was sitting on a stool reading. I closed my book. Hattie, Linda, I would like to talk. I would not. I have driven a long way. I have been here the whole time. We looked at each other. She was wearing the same coat from November. Her hair was pulled back tight, the way she did it when she was about to do business. I could see her gathering herself for whatever she had come here to say. I didn't help her. I didn't fill the silence. I had stopped filling silences for Linda the day I closed the door on her in November, and I had not gone back to it. Your father is leaving me, she said. I did not move. He told me last week. He said he wanted a divorce. He said he had been thinking about it for months. He said he was going to file. Okay, he said. Her voice was tight. He said you would not see him while we were married. He said you had made that clear, and he could not live with it anymore. I never said that. You said it. I said he could be in my life on my terms, in my house, on my schedule. I said he could not bring you within 50 miles of this shop. I did not say he had to leave you to see me. Linda stood there. I could see her processing. I could see her trying to figure out how to repackage what was happening so that it could still be my fault. I had watched her do this 1,000 times growing up, and I knew every step of it. The flicker of the eyes, the slight shift of weight, the recalibration. "Hattie," she said, "I don't know what I did to you. I don't know what I did to make you hate me this much." "I don't hate you, Linda." "Then why?" "Because you took from me. You took my father. You took my mother's house. You took my home. You took every Christmas and every birthday and every dinner table conversation, and you made them about you. And when I was finally too tired to keep playing along, you put me on the curb. I don't hate you. I just don't owe you anything. Not a conversation. Not a piece of furniture. Not $1 of what my grandfather left me. Nothing. And I am not going to pretend otherwise." She stood there. Her face was very white. "Your father will regret this." "Maybe. He's a weak man, Hattie. He always was. He'll come crawling back. They always do." "Maybe." I picked my book back up. I started reading again, or pretending to read again, my eyes on the page and my whole body listening. Linda stood at the counter for almost a minute. Then she turned and she walked out. The bell jangled. The door closed. I did not see her again. My father's divorce was finalized in June, the same month the coins were sold. He moved into a small apartment near his work. He called me every Sunday, like he'd said he would. Some Sundays I picked up and some Sundays I didn't. The Sundays I picked up, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, his work, a book he was reading, a movie I had seen. We did not talk about Linda. We did not talk about the years she had been in the house. We did not talk about my mother. We were not ready yet for any of that. But we talked about other things, and that was something, and it was more than we had had in a decade. He came up to visit for the first time in August. He stayed 2 nights at the inn at the end of Mercer Street. I made him dinner in the apartment above the shop. He helped me hang a new ceiling fan in the front room. He met Gus, and they sat on the steps of the barber shop together drinking coffee from the diner, and I watched them through the window, and I thought my grandfather would have liked that. He would have liked that very much. I did not give my father any of the money. He did not ask for any of the money. The first time he visited, he tried to pay me back for the meals I cooked, and I told him to stop, and he stopped. We were going to figure it out as we went. The shop stayed open. I kept running it, 3 days a week at first, then 4, then 5. I learned to do appraisals myself, with Wendell's help over the phone, and eventually I started taking in pieces that needed real expertise. By the time a full year had passed since the night Linda put me on the curb, I was running the only working pawn shop in 3 counties, and I had a small but loyal customer base, and I had started taking community college classes in business and accounting 2 evenings a week, paying out of pocket because I didn't want to touch the inheritance money for anything that wasn't necessary. The inheritance money sat in 3 different accounts that Wendell had helped me set up. Some of it was in long-term investments. Some of it was in a savings account for emergencies. Some of it I gave away. Not in a big public way. I didn't make a fuss. I started a small fund through the local library, in my grandfather's name, that gave grants to teenagers in Bowdrie who needed help paying for first-year college costs. Books, fees, a laptop, a bus ticket. The kind of things I had not had. The library administered it, and I funded it quietly, and the local newspaper did a small story about it that mentioned my name once, in the 7th paragraph, the way I had asked them to. I bought Gus a new chair for his barber shop because his old one had been making a noise like a dying frog for years, and he refused to replace it. He fought me on it for 3 weeks. He sat in the new chair the first day I had it delivered, swiveled around in it slowly, looked at me, and said, "You've gone and ruined the place, child. It looks like a salon." Then he hugged me, which Gus did not do often, and he told me Floyd would have done the same thing and I should not feel guilty about it, which I had not, until he said it, and then I did, a little, but not enough to take the chair back. I paid for Eldrada Marsh's gravestone to be cleaned and reset. I had gone looking for it, the spring after the auction. She was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The stone had been simple sandstone and was leaning badly, and the lettering had gotten hard to read. I paid a local stonemason to clean it and reset it and recut her name. I did not put my name on anything. I just had it done. I went out one morning in April and looked at it and thought about her sitting in my grandfather's shop in 1996 with her $140 and her dead husband and the silver tea set that she had loved and could not eat. I cried a little. I always did when I thought about the pieces. About the people who had been in trouble and had walked in and asked my grandfather for help. He had paid them. He had been fair. The teapot in the case had not been a treasure until it was, but for the years before it became a treasure it had been a man's funeral, and that was the part one never wanted to forget. Cyrus Mooney's great-grandson, I tracked down. It took me 3 months of looking. He was a 60-year-old man living in Tennessee, a retired electrician, and he had no idea his great-grandfather's saber had survived. I called him on a Sunday afternoon. I told him who I was. I told him about the saber. I told him I had sold it, but I had kept a third of the proceeds aside in case any descendants of the original owner ever came looking, because it had been a family piece, and the saber should not have been pawned by his grandfather in the first place, but had been in 2009, in a moment of desperation, and that desperation should not be the whole story. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. He told me he didn't know what to say. I told him he didn't have to say anything. I told him I had a check, and an address would be fine, and if he wanted to come up and see Bowdrie sometime, I would buy him dinner. I sent him $18,000 3 days later. He came up that summer. He sat in the front of the shop with me and Gus, and he cried a little and laughed a little, and he told me stories about his great-grandfather that he had heard from his own grandmother when he was a boy. I gave him the documentation Wendell had compiled on the saber, the provenance, the regiment, the engagement at Gettysburg. He took it home with him. He sent me a Christmas card that year. He has sent me a Christmas card every year since. I did similar things, on a smaller scale, for several of the other pieces. Not all of them. Some of the records had been kept too poorly. Some of the families had moved or scattered or could not be found. But the ones I could find, I tried. It was not what my grandfather had set up. He had pawned those pieces legally and had owned them outright, and had sold them legitimately, and he did not owe anybody anything. I knew that. He had told me that, in the letter, very clearly. But I had decided, sitting in that small back room reading his notebook for the first time, that I was going to do this part differently. He had given me the foundation. I got to decide what to build on it. The shop is still open. It has been almost 4 years now since I walked into Bowdrie with 2 garbage bags and a backpack. The sign out front is freshly painted. The window has a new pane. The roof doesn't leak anymore. I expanded into the building next door last spring when the space came available, after Gus retired and moved to be closer to his daughter, and I run a small consignment and antiques business out of that side now, with a young woman from town who has a much better eye for textiles than I do. We are still very small. We are not getting rich. The money from my grandfather's estate sits where it sits and grows slowly, and I draw a modest salary from the shop, and that is what I live on. I am 23 years old. I will turn 24 in a few months. I am taking the last classes of my associate's degree in business administration this fall, and I will start working on a bachelor's after that, taking it slow, because I am in no hurry, because I have the rest of my life, and there is no rush. My father comes up the first weekend of every month. He has gotten the hang of the back roads. He stays at the inn. We have dinner on Saturday night and breakfast on Sunday morning before he drives home. We have started talking about my mother the last year or so. Carefully, in small pieces. He tells me things I didn't know about her. The way she sang in the car. The way she pronounced certain words wrong on purpose because it made me laugh when I was little. The fact that she had wanted 3 children and we had not been able to have them, and that had been a sadness she carried for a long time. I write the things he tells me in a notebook, the way my grandfather kept a notebook. I am collecting her. I am collecting them both. The small back room is still there, behind the metal door. The door is unlocked now. The shelves are mostly empty. I keep my grandmother's pearls in a velvet pouch on the top shelf, where they catch the light from the bulb. I keep my grandfather's pocket watch on a small stand in the center of the table. The 1849 Liberty head is in a clear case beside it. I sit in the chairs sometimes, when the shop is quiet, and I look at the photograph on the back wall. Floyd, in 1985, with his cigarette and his enormous smile. He's about the age I am now in that picture. He has not lost any teeth yet. He has not buried his wife yet. He is just a man standing in front of his shop on a sunny day, looking at whoever held the camera like he loved them. I think it was my grandmother who held the camera. I have decided to believe that. I sit in the chair and I look at him, and sometimes I talk to him. Out loud. Not long conversations. Just little things. I tell him what the weather is doing. I tell him who came in that day. I tell him my father called and I picked up. I tell him I gave a kid $40 extra on a pawn ticket today because he reminded me of someone. And I tell my grandfather I think he would have done the same. Sometimes I think I can feel him there. I know how that sounds. I don't care how it sounds. He was there for me before I could feel him. He was there for 19 years, building me a way out. In a back room I didn't know existed. In a town I had never been to. In a state I had never visited. He was there the whole time. He is still there. He always will be. I think about that night a lot. The night Linda put me on the curb. The cold. The streetlight melting in the rain. My father's hands on the curtains, drawing them shut. I thought, that night, that the world had ended. I thought I had reached the bottom of something. I had no money and no people and no plan and no place to go. And I sat in a bus station with a cup of cold coffee a stranger had given me. And I had never been more alone in my life. And what I want to tell you, what I want anyone watching this to understand, is that the bottom of something is sometimes the floor of something else. The night I thought my life was over was the night my life started. Everything I am now, everything I have, every person I love, and every person who loves me back, is downstream of that night. If Linda had not put me on the curb, if my father had not closed the curtains, if I had not opened the envelope, if I had not gotten on the bus, if I had not walked 4 blocks through the rain to a locked door with my grandfather's name on it, if I had not met Gus and Wendell and the woman who had run the bus station counter, if, the worst night of my life was the door that everything good walked through. I do not think this is true for everybody. I do not think every terrible night is a door. I think some terrible nights are just terrible nights. But I think more of them are doors than we think. I think more of them have keys hidden in places we have not yet looked. I think the people who love us, even the ones who are gone, even the ones whose funerals we were not allowed to attend, are very often working in rooms we do not know about, building something. Quietly. For years. For us. My grandfather built me a way out. I built the rest of it myself. I am still building it. The shop is open. The sign is painted. The kettle in the back is on. If you ever come through Bowdrie, on a Tuesday through Saturday, between 10 and 6, the door will be unlocked. You can come in. I will pour you a cup of coffee. I will not ask you what brought you here. I will just be glad you walked through. The girl who walked through the door on the second Tuesday of October was 17 years old. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder and a backpack on the other, and she stood just inside the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to come further. The bell over the door was still jangling when I looked up from the ledger I was working on. I had been doing accounts. I had a pen in my hand and a smudge of ink on the side of my finger, and the kettle in the back was about to whistle, and a girl walked into my shop carrying her whole life on her shoulders, and I knew before she said anything what kind of day she was having. "Are you open?" she said. "Yes. I need to pawn something." "Okay." She didn't move. She stood by the door, and she looked at the floor, and she breathed. I had seen people do this exact thing 100 times in the years I had been running the shop, and I had developed a feel for when to push and when to wait. I waited. The kettle whistled. I went back and turned it off. I came back out and I sat on my stool behind the counter, and I picked up my pen and pretended to look at the ledger. The girl took 2 steps into the shop. 3. She came up to the counter slowly, and she set her bags down on the floor next to her feet. She put her hands flat on the glass case in front of her. She had short fingernails, painted black, the polish chipped on 3 of them. She had a small scar on the knuckle of her ring finger. She was wearing a hooded sweatshirt that was too thin for the weather, and her cheeks were red from cold. "What did you bring me?" I said. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a watch. It was a man's wristwatch with a leather band that had been replaced more than once, and a face that had a small chip in the crystal near the 6. She set it on the counter between us. I picked it up. I knew without looking at the brand that it was nothing. It was a department store watch from the early 2000s. The kind people had bought their fathers for Christmas, and the fathers had worn for 10 years, and then put in a drawer. The mechanism inside was probably fine, but the watch itself, as an object, was worth maybe $20 to a buyer who liked it. I turned it over. There was an engraving on the back. To Dad, with love, Coraline. I set the watch down on the velvet cloth I kept on the counter for this purpose. Coraline. Yeah. How much do you need? She looked at me. Her eyes were dry. They had not been dry recently. $200. I can't give you $200 for this watch. Okay. She picked it up and started to put it back in her pocket. Hang on. I didn't say you couldn't have $200. I said I couldn't give it to you for the watch. The watch is worth $20. Tell me what the $200 is for, and I'll tell you if I can help you another way. She put the watch down. She put both hands flat on the counter again. She didn't sit down because I didn't have a chair on her side of the counter, an oversight I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I need a bus ticket to Asheville, and then I need to eat for a couple of days while I figure out where I'm going to stay. And I need a few things from the drugstore. Where did you come from? Lynchburg. That's a long way. Yeah. And you came to Bowdrie because... She hesitated. She looked at me, really looked, for the first time. I saw her notice the photograph on the back wall behind me, the one of my grandfather. She looked at it for a long second. My grandma told me about this place. A long time ago. She said if I was ever in trouble I should come here. What was your grandmother's name? Beatrice. Beatrice Whitmore. I knew the name. I had seen it in my grandfather's notebook. Entry 23. A set of silver picture frames, taken in 1989, against a loan of $45 to pay an electric bill. Beatrice Whitmore had come back 6 months later and redeemed them. There had been a small note in the margin of the entry that said, "Good woman. Hard year. Bring her something extra at Christmas." I knew your grandmother, I said. Coraline looked at me. You didn't know my grandmother. I knew of her. From my grandfather's records. She came here once in 1989 and pawned a set of silver picture frames. She redeemed them. My grandfather thought well of her. She's dead. I'm sorry. She died last spring. I'm sorry. I waited a moment, and then I said, Coraline, how old are you? 18. Try again. She looked at the counter. 17. Are your parents looking for you? She did the thing I had done in the bus station 4 years ago. She laughed without smiling. It was a short, hard laugh that came out of her mouth before she could stop it. No, she said. They are not looking for me. Okay. I came around the counter. She flinched a little when I moved, but she held her ground. I walked past her to the front door, and I locked it, and I turned the sign in the window from open to closed. Then I walked into the back of the shop, and I picked up the kettle, and I made 2 cups of tea, one for her and one for me, and I brought them out and set them on the counter. I went into the apartment upstairs, and I came back down with a chair, a wooden one with a cushion tied to it that I had bought at a yard sale the previous summer. I set it on her side of the counter. Sit down, I said. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug of tea like she had not been warm in a long time. We sat in the shop together drinking the tea. I did not ask her questions. I let her get to the temperature of the room. After maybe 10 minutes, she started talking. Her parents had divorced when she was 8. Her mother had remarried. Her mother's new husband was not a kind man. The mother had not been a kind woman to start with, and the new husband had not improved her. And for 9 years, Coraline had been raising herself in a house where the rules changed every week and the food was sometimes there and sometimes not. Her grandmother, her father's mother, had been the bright spot. Beatrice. She had lived in the next town over, and she had taken Coraline every weekend she could. She had taught her to cook. She had bought her first real coat. She had told her stories about a man in Bowdrie who had once helped her when she was young and broke and scared, and had not made her feel small about it. Beatrice had died in April. Coraline had stayed through the summer. She had finished her junior year of high school. Then her mother's husband had taken Coraline's bedroom door off the hinges as a punishment for something Coraline did not actually remember doing, and Coraline had decided that night, lying on her bed with no door, that she was going to leave. She had spent 3 months saving money from a part-time job and stealing small bills out of her mother's purse, and she had bought a bus ticket as far as her money would take her, which was Lynchburg, and from Lynchburg, she had hitchhiked the rest of the way because she had wanted to come to the town her grandmother had described, the town with the pawn shop where a man named Reeves had helped her grandmother once. Floyd Reeves, I said. That was him. Floyd is dead. Yeah, he's been dead a long time. I'm Hattie Reeves. He was my grandfather. He left me the shop. Coraline drank her tea. Her hands had stopped shaking. Do you have anywhere to go in Asheville? I said. I have a friend there. From the internet. She said I could stay with her for a couple of weeks. Have you met her in person? No. Coraline. I know. You know. I know. She set down the mug. I know it's stupid. I know what it sounds like. But I had to get out of that house, and she's the only person I knew who would have me. And if she turns out to be terrible, she's not worse than what I left. She can be terrible and still not be worse. I sat with that. I thought about myself at her age. I thought about the bus station and the woman who had given me coffee without ringing it up. I thought about the long road north and the night I had spent in a bus seat with my head against the cold window. I thought about how, if my grandfather had not left me an envelope, I would have gotten off the bus somewhere and slept on a bench and trusted whoever was the first person to be slightly kind to me. I thought about how lucky I had been. I thought about how lucky was a word that should not have to be in the same sentence as the words a 19-year-old girl in the rain. Okay, I said. Here's what we are going to do. Tonight you are going to stay upstairs. There's an apartment over the shop. It has a guest room. It has a bathroom with hot water and a shower and clean towels. There is food in the refrigerator, and I will cook you dinner. Tomorrow we will sit down together at this counter, and we will look at the situation in daylight, when you have slept and eaten. We will look at where you want to go and how you want to get there. If, after that conversation, you still want to go to Asheville to stay with someone you have never met, I will buy you a bus ticket. Cash. From me. Not a loan. Not a pawn. A gift. But you are going to give me one night before you do anything else. Is that a deal? She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes filled up, slowly, and she did not let any of it fall. She nodded. Yes, she said. That's a deal. Good. I picked up the watch from the counter. The one her grandmother had given her father, that her father had given her, that she had carried 600 miles in her hoodie pocket. I slid it back across the counter to her. Keep this, I said. This one's not for me. She put the watch in her pocket. She picked up her bags. I took her upstairs to the apartment, and I showed her the guest room, which was small and clean and had a window that looked over the alley behind the shop. The bed was made. There were 2 extra blankets folded on a shelf in the closet. The bathroom across the hall had a stack of clean towels and a new toothbrush in the cabinet because I kept new toothbrushes for situations like this. Although until that day, I had not had a situation like this. I left her there with the door closed, and I went downstairs and I sat at the counter, and I called my father. He picked up on the third ring. Hey, sweetheart. Dad, everything okay? I need to think out loud at someone. Do you have a few minutes? I have all the minutes. I told him what had happened. I told him who Coraline was, and where she had come from, and what she had said. I told him about Beatrice Whitmore, the entry in my grandfather's notebook, the silver picture frames. I told him I was going to give the girl a bed for the night and feed her and probably, in the morning, do something more than that, although I did not know yet what the more was. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Hattie, yeah, you know what you're doing. I think so. Your grandfather would have done the same thing. I know. That's not what's scaring me. What's scaring you? I had to think about how to say it. I'm scared that she's going to leave in the morning anyway. I'm scared that I'm going to do all of this, and she's going to walk out the door and get on a bus to Asheville and disappear into the apartment of someone who lied to her on the internet. And I'm going to sit here for the rest of my life wondering what happened to her. My father was quiet again. He said, You're going to wonder anyway, sweetheart. Even if she stays a year, even if she stays 5, you're going to wonder about her until you don't anymore, and that's how it works. That's how it worked for Floyd with you. He wondered about you every day from the year you were born until the day he died. He told me, the last time I saw him. He said, I wonder how she is every day, Joe. Every single day? I had not known that. My father did not often give me pieces of my grandfather. It cost him something to do it, every time, because every piece was also a piece of his own failure to have been better to his father, and I knew that, and I had learned to receive the pieces carefully when he gave them. Thank you, I said. I love you. I love you too, Dad. We hung up. I cooked dinner. I made a pot of chicken and rice, and I cut up an apple for dessert. I knocked on Coraline's door at 6:30, and she came down, and she sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment, and she ate 2 plates of rice without saying anything. After the second plate, she said, I haven't eaten anything hot in 3 days. I figured. It's really good. Thank you. We washed dishes together. She washed and I dried because she wanted to wash, she said, because washing felt like doing something. After the dishes, she went back to the guest room, and she closed the door, and I heard the shower run for a long time. I heard her cry, in the shower, in the way people cry when they are trying not to be heard. I sat on the couch in the living room, and I read a book, and I did not knock on the door. I had learned, from being on her side of that door once, that the kindest thing you could do for a person crying in a shower was let them cry. The next morning, I made eggs. She came down at 8, in clean clothes she had pulled from her duffel bag, her hair wet and combed. She sat at the table, and she ate the eggs. We did not talk much. After breakfast, I told her to come downstairs to the shop when she was ready, and she said okay, and an hour later she came down. She sat in the chair I had brought down from upstairs the day before. I sat on my stool. I had the kettle going. Coraline. Yes. I want to offer you something. You can say no. I want you to know that up front. You can say no, and I will still buy you the bus ticket, and I will still send you with a bag of food and the address of a women's shelter in Asheville that I have already called this morning. That has a bed available for 2 weeks if your friend turns out to be what we are worried she might be. That is the floor of what I am offering. You walk out of here with a bed waiting for you somewhere safer than your mother's house. Are you with me so far? Yes. The ceiling of what I am offering is this. I have a guest room upstairs that has been empty for 4 years. I am 23 years old, and I run a pawn shop, and I do not need a roommate, financially. But I have started thinking, the last year or so, that I have a lot of room in my life that nobody is using. You could have the guest room. You could finish high school here. Bowdrie has a perfectly fine high school. It's 3 blocks from this building. You could enroll as my dependent. I have already talked to the principal about how that would work, in theory, because I called her this morning while you were sleeping. There would be paperwork. There would be a conversation with your mother. Probably with a lawyer. It would not be easy, but it could be done. And after high school, you could decide what you want to do, and I would help you do that, whatever it was. College, trade school, a job somewhere. You could stay here for as long as you wanted, and you could leave whenever you wanted, and there would be no strings, no expectations, nothing you owed me. The room would be yours. That is the ceiling. She stared at me. She did not blink for what felt like a long time. Why are you doing this? Because 4 years ago someone did it for me. Who? An old man named Augustus Henning. He took me in on the day I got off the bus. He fed me, and he made me coffee, and he gave me the key to this building, and he sat with me when I cried. He did not know me. He had known my grandfather. That was enough for him. He's retired now. He moved away last year. But he's the reason I'm sitting here. He's the reason I have a place to offer you. The chain only goes if people pass it along, Coraline. That's all I'm doing. I'm passing it along. I'm not doing anything special. She put her hands over her face. She sat like that for a long minute. When she lowered her hands, her cheeks were wet. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything today. You take your time. We can sit here all morning. I have nowhere to be. She took her time. She took until after lunch. We ate sandwiches together at the counter, and she didn't talk much, and I didn't push. Around 2 in the afternoon, a customer came in to pawn a guitar, and I dealt with that, and Coraline sat in her chair and watched me do it. And after the man left, she said, "Can you teach me to do that?" To do what? To know what something's worth. To talk to people about it. To run the shop. Yes, I can teach you that. Then I would like to stay. I tried to keep my face still. I think I succeeded, because she was looking at me carefully to see what I would do, and I had learned, in 4 years of running a small business in a small town, that a face that gave away too much made other people guard themselves. I nodded. I said, "Okay then. We will figure out the paperwork. We will figure out everything else as we go." "Okay." "Coraline." "Yes." "Welcome home." She cried then, not the silent kind. She put her head down on the counter, and she cried the way I had cried in the bus station 4 years ago, the leaking kind, the kind that comes out of a person who has been holding too much for too long and has finally found a place where she is allowed to put it down. I came around the counter, and I sat in the chair next to her, and I did not touch her, because I did not know if she wanted to be touched, but I sat near enough that she could lean if she wanted to lean, and after a while she did. The paperwork took 6 months. It was harder than I had told her it would be, although I think she knew that. There were court appearances. There were lawyers, mine and one assigned to her, paid for by the state, a young man who turned out to be very good. There was a guardian ad litem and a social worker and a hearing at which Coraline's mother, who had not in fact looked for her since the day she left, was given the opportunity to contest the arrangement and chose not to. Her mother signed the papers without an argument, which surprised everyone except Coraline, who had told me from the beginning that her mother would not fight for her, because her mother had never fought for her, and a person did not start that habit at 51. By April, Coraline was officially my legal ward. She had enrolled in Bowdrie High School in January, as a junior. She was, against everyone's expectations including her own, an excellent student. She had a thing for math that nobody had ever noticed because nobody had ever asked her about it. She finished her junior year on the honor roll. She worked in the shop on weekends. By the time spring of her senior year came, she was running the counter on Saturdays by herself, and I was using my Saturdays to do other things, like sleep, like read a book, like go for a long walk along the river and not think about pawn tickets at all. My father met her the first weekend in November, the month after she had come to stay. He drove up on his usual schedule. He had been told, on the phone, what had happened, and he had said, "Of course, sweetheart, of course," in the voice he used when he was trying to be the father he had not been when I was young. When he arrived, he did not make a big thing of it. He shook Coraline's hand. He asked her how her week had been. He treated her, from the first minute, like a person who lived in my house, because that was what she was. They became friends, slowly, the way reserved people become friends. He brought her a book of math puzzles the second time he visited, which she pretended not to like, and then did every one of in a single weekend. He started bringing her things, when he came up, the way he had started bringing me things. Not big things. A novel he had read. A box of fancy cookies. A pair of warm socks. The currency of a man who had not been good at being a father and was trying, on a second pass, to do better, in small, steady ways. The night before Coraline graduated from high school, almost 2 years after she had walked through my door with the watch in her pocket, I went into the back room of the shop alone. I had not been back there in a while. I had not had a reason. The shelves were still mostly empty. My grandmother's pearls were still in their velvet pouch on the top shelf. My grandfather's pocket watch was still on the stand in the center of the table. The 1849 Liberty head was still in its case. I sat down in the chair. I looked at the photograph on the wall. I had been thinking, all spring, about my mother. About what I had been collecting of her in the notebook my father had been filling for me, slowly, one visit at a time. About the letters she had written to my grandfather. The bundle in the 4th small box from the safe, which I had read once, all the way through, the spring after the first auction, and had not been able to read again since. I had not been able to read them again because they had hurt too much. I had been 12 when she died. I had not known her as a person. I had known her as my mother, which was something different from a person. The letters had shown me a person. The person had been funny. She had been sharper than I remembered. She had been worried about things that I had not known she was worried about. She had been a real woman with a real interior life, and she had been gone before I had ever met her. The letters had grieved me a second time. I had put them back in the box, and I had not opened the box again, and I had not been ready to open it again until that night. I took the box down. I sat with it on the table. I untied the ribbon. I read the letters again, slowly, one at a time. There were 43 of them. They covered 3 years, from the year my mother turned 20 until the year I was born. She had written to her father almost every month. She had told him about her job, her apartment, the man she was dating who would become my father, the dog she had adopted, the trip she had taken to Charleston. She had told him she was scared when she found out she was pregnant. She had told him she was happy when she felt the baby kick for the first time. She had told him, in the second-to-last letter, that she had decided to name me Hattie. She had told him, in the last letter, that she could not wait for him to meet me. The letter was dated 3 weeks before I was born. I sat with the last letter for a long time. I had read it before, but I had not read it the way I read it that night. With 2 years of Coraline behind me, with my father showing up the first weekend of every month, with a daughter, almost, of my own. I read it the way a parent reads it. I had not known I could read it that way. I had not known I had become that. At the bottom of the box, under the letters, was a single sheet of paper I had not noticed the first time. It had been pressed flat against the bottom and had stuck to it. I lifted it out very carefully. It was in my grandfather's handwriting. He had written it at the same time as the other letters in the envelope upstairs, the ones that had been waiting for me. He had written it the week before he died. It said, "Hattie, if you have come back to these letters, you are ready. You are not ready the first time. Nobody is ready the first time. You are ready the second time, or the third time, or the 10th time. You are ready when you can read them and see her instead of feeling her absence." I read them every year on her birthday. I read them again on the anniversary of the day she died. I read them on her wedding anniversary, although she would have laughed at me for that. They are her, Hattie, as much of her as we have left. I am giving them to you because you are the only other person who should have them. Read them often. Read them when you are happy. Read them when you are sad. Read them out loud, someday, to your own children, if you have them, so they will know the sound of her. She was the best person I knew. She was better than me. She was better than your father, although I love him, and I forgive him, and I hope you do too eventually, because he was her husband, and he was my son, and he tried, in his way, even when he failed. She would have wanted you to forgive him. She would have wanted everything good for you. I have tried to give you what I could. The rest is yours. Granddad. I cried for an hour, in the small back room, with the door closed. I cried the way you cry when you are not 19 anymore, when the crying does not break you, when you have enough of yourself around the crying to hold it. I cried for my mother, and I cried for my grandfather, and I cried for the version of myself who had not known any of this yet. And then I dried my face, and I went upstairs and I knocked on Coraline's door. She was packing for graduation. She had laid out the dress I had bought her the week before, blue, simple, with a small white collar. She was checking her phone. She looked up when I came in. "Hey," she said. "Hey, what's up? I want to tell you something. About my mother. Is that okay?" "Yeah." She set the phone down. "Yeah, of course." I sat on the edge of her bed. She sat on the desk chair. I told her about my mother. About the letters. About what I had just read. About what my grandfather had written at the bottom of the box. I told her things I had never told anybody. I told her things I had not known I knew until they came out of my mouth. She listened. She did not interrupt. At the end, when I had run out of things to say, she said, "Hattie." "Yeah. Can I read them? The letters?" I had not expected the question. I sat with it. I thought about what my grandfather had written. He had said the letters were mine. He had not said they were only mine. He had said to read them out loud, someday, to my own children, if I had them. He had not been thinking of Coraline. He had not known Coraline. But he had been thinking of someone like her. He had been thinking of whoever I might one day decide to let into the room with me. "Yes," I said. "You can read them." I went down to the shop, and I brought the box up. I gave it to her. She took it carefully, like she knew what was in it. I went back to my own room, and I lay on my bed, and I looked at the ceiling for a long time. The next day, Coraline graduated. She walked across the stage in her blue dress with the white collar, and she shook the principal's hand, and she took her diploma. My father drove up for the ceremony. He sat next to me in the gym, and when Coraline's name was called, he clapped harder than any other parent in the room. I watched him do it, his face turned up toward the stage, and I thought, this is a man who is trying. This is a man who did not try, when he should have tried, when it would have mattered most, when his daughter was 12 and her mother was dead and her stepmother was beginning a long, slow campaign. He did not try then. He is trying now. I do not know what to do with that exactly. I do not know if I have forgiven him in the way my grandfather hoped I would. I do not know if I will. But he is trying, and I am letting him, and that is more than I would have been able to do 5 years ago, and I think it might be enough for now. After the ceremony, the three of us went to dinner at the steakhouse in town, the same place Wendell and Gus and I had gone the night of the first auction. Coraline ordered a steak. My father ordered a steak. I ordered a chicken sandwich because some things do not change. We sat in a booth in the back, and we ate and we talked, and Coraline laughed at something my father said. And my father looked at me across the table when she laughed, and I saw in his face the same thing I had felt the first time she laughed in my kitchen, 6 months in, when I had finally heard what she sounded like when she wasn't afraid. We had made a person comfortable. The two of us. We had made a person, in a way, although she had done most of the making herself. We had been her room. We had been her open door. After dinner, my father drove back to his apartment 3 states away, and Coraline and I drove back to the apartment above the shop, and she went to her room to change out of her dress, and I went into the back of the shop one more time. I unlocked the metal door. I turned on the light. I looked at the small room where my grandfather had hidden the pieces of his work for 41 years. I looked at the empty shelves. I looked at his photograph. I think she's going to be okay, I said out loud to him. I think we are all going to be okay. The bulb buzzed quietly above me. The shop was silent. The town outside was settling into evening. I turned off the light. I closed the door. I went upstairs to find Coraline. There was tea to make. There was a graduation present to give her. There was the rest of our lives to figure out, slowly, one Tuesday at a time, in the small bright rooms of a building my grandmother had bought in 1981 because she had wanted a granddaughter to leave it to. The granddaughter she had never met had grown up. The granddaughter she had never met had a daughter, almost, of her own. The chain went forward. The door stayed open. The kettle was on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.